We'll take you live now to Canberra.
Australia in Canberra, and today's Westpac address. My name is Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. Prime Minister Scott Morrison returns to the National Press Club today for his 16th appearance, 6th as Prime Minister so far, and of course he's also appeared here in various other capacities over the years. As I mentioned last week, the leaders' speeches at the club have unofficially come to be seen as the official commencement of the political year. And this year, more than many others, is likely to be an extraordinary one, an election year in the time of a global pandemic. Last week, Opposition Leader Anthony Albanese moved quickly to try to set the political agenda. As has been widely publicised this morning, the Prime Minister sounds like he has a veritable smorgasbord of announcements to make today. If you are following the conversation online, you can find us on Twitter. Our user handle is @PressClubAust and our hashtag is NPC. Please join me in welcoming Prime Minister Scott Morrison.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back here at the National Press Club again at the start of another year. Let me begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, their elders past, present and emerging. And I also recognise any veterans who are here with us today, as well as any serving men and women of our Australian Defence Forces. And thank you all for your great service to our country. Can I particularly acknowledge, and have many colleagues here today, so I'm not going to call the roll, but to the Deputy Prime Minister, Barnaby, it's great to have you here with me. And also, can I acknowledge my dear friend Marise Payne, for one particular reason. In just a few weeks' time, Marise will become the longest-serving female senator in Australia's history. And the longest continuous-serving parliamentarian as a female. And so congratulations to you, Marise. You're a great colleague and you've served our country incredibly well. And as a Liberal, I'm very proud of you, and as a mate too. The past 3 years have been some of the most extraordinary that our nation has ever experienced. Younger generations have never known anything like it. The succession of natural disasters, from drought to flood, fires, pestilence, a once-in-a-century global pandemic, the recession it caused, has pushed our country to the very limits. It has been tough raising your family, keeping your job, doing your job, especially for those health and aged care workers who we thank for their tremendous service. It's been tough keeping your small business or your farm going. It's been tough keeping your children's education up, caring for elderly relatives, those with a disability, and it's been very tough on them too. Family plans have been disrupted, and worst of all, it's been heartbreaking to lose so many loved ones, especially in recent weeks, and on occasions where we couldn't even come together to farewell them. Our way of life has been completely turned upside down. For so many Australians, I know it's been exhausting, financially, physically, emotionally. And when we thought we might just be breaking free, the rains have come, the cyclone has hit, or a new and completely different strain of the virus, like Omicron, has come and changed all the rules. And I don't doubt many have stayed awake at night after telling their kids, or those they care for, or those they employ, it's all going to be okay. But wondering themselves in the quiet of that night whether it really will be. I can tell you as Prime Minister, I can assure you, I've asked those same questions. I've lived with those same doubts over these past 3 years. It's been crushing to visit towns and homes devastated, often with Jen, by storms, ravaged by flood or fires, to walk across barren pastures, to see the queues outside Centrelink or testing centres, to see the empty shops and restaurants, as I saw in Cairns just earlier over the weekend, to see the lives and livelihoods of Australians disrupted through no fault of their own and through circumstances well beyond theirs and our control often. So I understand and I acknowledge the frustration, especially with how this global pandemic has played out over this past very difficult summer. And I want to thank Australians. You've had to put up with a lot. The fact that far worse outcomes have been experienced overseas, which we know, well, that gives some important perspective, but it doesn't soften the blow. And it's fair enough that this disappointment leads you to ask, couldn't you have done more? Couldn't this have been avoided? After all, aren't you responsible? I get that. For me as Prime Minister, accepting this responsibility means asking yourself and challenging yourself every single day with those same questions. And I can assure you I do. I haven't got everything right. And I'll take my fair share of the criticism and the blame. It goes with the job. But so does getting up each day, dealing with the challenges, staying positive, and believing in the strength and good nature and resilience of the Australian people. And above all, never giving up. In these times we've experienced, there's been no guidebook, and you have to make decisions in real time. But with hindsight, the view does change, and lessons are learned, lessons that will continue to be invaluable to me and so many of my team who are here with me today, and those who are out there with Australians in their communities, to deal with the challenges and uncertainties that are still definitely ahead. And I'd like to share a few of them with you. Firstly, you've always got to focus on getting the balance right. From the outset of the pandemic, I've said our twin goals have been to save lives and to save livelihoods. This is how we protect our Australian way of life. And I've always sought to balance our health objectives with our broader societal and economic well-being. We must respect the virus, but we must not live in fear of it. You must be prepared to listen to that advice, but also to take the decisions that strike the right balance, because it is we who have been trusted with those decisions. Secondly, you must be very practical. The virus does not care what your political views are. It writes the rules about how it behaves, and we must then write our rules about how we respond. And these rules must be flexible. They will change. There is no set and forget in a pandemic like this. There are times when you have to pull back, and there are times when you have to push forward. And what may have been the right response, absolutely at one point in time in the pandemic, it'll flip on you. And it may not be the right response in a later phase of the pandemic. Thirdly, you must accept that you may lose a few battles along the way. And when these setbacks occur, you must keep moving forward. You can't dwell on the things that didn't play out as you may have expected or liked. When this occurs, the job is to get across the problem and make the changes needed as soon as possible and get on with it. And this is what we did with the vaccine rollout. When our contracted supplies were blocked and the advisory bodies had limited our use of the AstraZeneca vaccine. These were big challenges, but we turned it around. It is what we're doing right now to overcome the supply chain shortages created by the onset of the Omicron variant. It's only been with us 2 months, and this included the supply of rapid antigen tests. Since the beginning of the pandemic, COVID-19 tests have always been free at official testing clinics. Never changed. These tests have been sourced and provided by the state and territory governments. The Commonwealth picks up 50% of the bill, just like those that are going out to schools right now. The unprecedented surge in cases caused by Omicron changed everything. It was like dealing with a completely new virus. The medical advice to government on the use of rapid antigen tests changed, and so did our response. And so since then, the government contracted 78 million rapid antigen tests to help meet significant new demands in the states and the territories and the private sector. Over 652,000 concession card holders have already accessed over 2.7 million free rapid antigen tests through the Community Pharmacy Concession Card Holder Program, which commenced just over a week ago. The government is also delivering 10 million rapid antigen tests to support state and territory clinics. And in our own area of responsibility, around 8 million tests have already been provided to aged care facilities, with the purchasing of those tests beginning back in August of last year. Now, fourthly, you must work together and learn from each other, but understand that everywhere is not the same. We have constantly engaged with experts and governments around the world to share experience, data and information, and they've learned from us, I can tell you. But that doesn't mean that what is done elsewhere is always the right solution for our conditions or circumstances here in Australia. Australia has many differences with the rest of the world. Our regulatory authorities, our seasons, our health and social security systems, our federation, unique. Cut and paste doesn't cut it in a pandemic. And that's why we designed JobKeeper. Rather than go down the UK path for wage subsidies, which others recommended, which we believe would have unfairly provided greater income support to those on higher wages than those on lower wages, and could not have been easily delivered or promptly delivered through our tax system and our payment system. So we said, no, that wasn't a good idea. We won't do that. We'll design a different system. And we did. And it saved lives and livelihoods all across this country. Fifthly, you must have clearly defined principles, grounded in your values to guide your decisions, and you've got to stick to them. Now, I'll outline these at the AFR summit back at the start of the pandemic, and they've included ensuring that initiatives and programs are targeted, that they're time limited, that they use existing delivery mechanisms, that they're proportionate, that they're fiscally responsible, that they're locally relevant and they're scalable. You must also focus on what you can control and what you're responsible for. A good example is respecting the constitutional responsibilities of the states and the Commonwealth under our federation. The pandemic did not suspend the Constitution or the federation. It did not change what the states and Commonwealth have always been responsible for. They didn't get any more powers, they didn't get any less. And I've always sought to put the national interest first by seeking to work together with the premiers and the chief ministers through the National Cabinet and not engage in petty fights. That wouldn't have helped anyone. My job was to keep everybody in the room working together. And I've sought to work together to make it work. And finally, never forget that there is more to deal with than COVID. During this pandemic, as just one example, we have simultaneously been dealing with one of the most significant shifts in global and regional security we have seen since before the Second World War. Changes that present a direct threat to Australia's economic and security interests. So while we have been battling the pandemic, we have concluded the historic AUKUS agreement. We have powered up the Quad. We've concluded a landmark defence agreement with Japan. We've supported our Pacific family, and we've concluded comprehensive strategic partnership agreements with some of our most important partners, India, the first country in the world to have one with ASEAN and all of those Southeast Asian nations that form it, and specifically with South Korea, Malaysia and our dear and great friends and brothers and sisters in Papua New Guinea. So here we are. Not perfect, but still standing strong, enduring and looking positively to the future, as earlier generations did when they faced their time of great generational trial and challenge. Let's talk about our health response more and the health resilience that we've built up. Our health response has ensured that our health and aged care system has stood up to the global pandemic, where in so many other countries we know around the world it collapsed. More than 40,000 lives have been saved in this country when compared to the death rate from COVID in other countries just like Australia. We have one of the lowest death rates from COVID in the world, including from Omicron. We have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. More than 93% of Australians aged 16 and over are fully vaccinated. Today, less than 1 year after vaccinations commenced in this country, Australia's 50 millionth COVID vaccination will be administered today. That's around 1 million on average every week, and that's included 8 million doses of boosters. We're also one of only a handful of countries, a small number, that are able to vaccinate children safely down to the age of 5. And since the pandemic began, our government has committed an additional $40 billion to support Australia's health response to the pandemic. It's more than Medicare and the PBS in any given year. This has included going 50-50 with states and territories, with over $8 billion provided to states and territories for the things they are responsible for: health systems, managing the pandemic, hospitals, testing, workforce costs. More than 91 million telehealth services have been delivered since the beginning of the pandemic, a big health innovation. New oral antiviral treatments for the COVID-19 are becoming available shortly, and the other antivirals are already in place. Our agreement with Moderna and the Victorian government announced last December, many months in the making, will ensure we can manufacture mRNA vaccines right here in Australia. That adds to our support for ResMed manufacturing ventilators in Western Sydney, Medcom's mask manufacturing in Shepparton, Aspen's medical manufacturing of PPE in Brisbane, Innovation Scientific's production of TGA-approved rapid antigen tests in Western Sydney, and of course CSL's manufacturing of vaccines and antivenoms in Melbourne. We've been making this stuff here. Of course, none of our health outcomes, though, would be possible without the hard work, the long hours and dedicated care offered by our frontline health and aged care workforce, the true heroes of this pandemic. Their resilience over the past 2 years has been nothing short of inspiring, and that's why I'm announcing today the government is providing, again, a further $209 million to support the aged care workforce to continue to care for older Australians through this pandemic. Now, this is a responsible commitment that builds on the $393 million already provided over 3 payments to 234,000 aged care workers earlier in the pandemic. It worked. We're doing it again. In coming months, 2 bonus payments of up to $400 each will be paid to aged care workers, including those providing direct care, food or cleaning services. Our pandemic investments in mental health and suicide prevention will also leave a lasting legacy. While every death by suicide is a tragedy, every life saved is a great blessing. Official figures show that while demands for mental health services surged off the charts during the pandemic, remarkably, death by suicide rates across the country actually fell and have remained at those lower levels. That's extraordinary. We funded services that did a brilliant job of saving lives. $1 billion in new funding for services such as Headspace, and shout out to Pat McGorry, been a great advisor to us and friend through all of this pandemic. Lifeline, to John Brogden and the whole team there. To Beyond Blue, Kids Helpline, Beyond Blue with Julia. Kids Helpline, reach out, Head to Health. They have done such an amazing job being there for Australians in their darkest hour. Our National Mental Health and Wellbeing Pandemic Response Plan was announced in May of 2020. Also, very early in the pandemic, when we were asking Australians to stay home, we knew and recognised that for so many, home is not safe for them, especially for women. And in March of 2020, as part of our $150 million COVID-19 domestic violence support package, we provided $20 million to boost capacity for Commonwealth programs, including 1800RESPECT, Men's Line, and the Help Is Here campaign. And in turn, $130 million was provided directly to state and territory governments for emergency accommodation for those impacted, and a range of frontline support services working together. Now this commitment has been extended a further 2 years. And to ensure the viability of the NDIS providers, we provided more than $666 million in advance payments and made changes to allow eligible NDIS providers to claim a payment to support their disability workers to be vaccinated against COVID-19. Strong health resilience built through a once-in-a-century pandemic. Our economy has also shown formidable resilience through the pandemic. It's outstripped the performance of most advanced economies in the world. And this was greatly assisted by entering the pandemic with a balanced budget delivered by strong financial management. While Omicron has impacted economic activity over January, Treasury analysis shows that the underlying strength of our economy is unshaken. On several occasions now, our economy has bounced back strongly from the impacts of the pandemic, and it will again. Our AAA credit rating remains intact, only one of 9 countries in the world to achieve this. At 3.5%, inflation in Australia is running well below other advanced economies, and the pressures are less than in those, such as 7% in the United States and 5% in the United Kingdom. There are more people in work today than before the pandemic. And even when compared to when I stood before you this time last year. In fact, there are more Australians of working age in a job today, 76.2%, than at any time in Australia's recorded economic history. That's what a jobs plan looks like when it works. Unemployment is at 4.2%. When I stood here a year ago, it was 6.6%. And women and young people have been the major beneficiaries of those job increases. Female employment, since we were elected, has increased more than 1 million. 1 million more women in work. And our youth unemployment rate has fallen to below 10% for the first time since 2008. And as my colleagues know, nothing puts a bigger smile on my face than hearing that young people are getting into jobs. Through the heavy lifting of more than $100 billion in federal government COVID business support, hundreds of thousands of livelihoods and businesses have been saved. And our ongoing tax incentives for investment, apprenticeship wage subsidies, and record investment in new training places are helping small and medium-sized businesses and their employees to push through. Our apprenticeship wage subsidies have driven a 27% increase in apprentices and trainees over the past year alone. Right now, there are 220,000 trade apprentices currently in training. That is the highest level of apprentices in trade training since records began in Australia in 1963. That's transformational. when we stared into this pandemic, one of the things the Treasurer and I were very keen to avoid was a lost generation of skills, and it so easily could have happened. The very first wage subsidy we provided was to keep apprentices in their training and in those businesses. And as I've moved across this country these last 2 years, I've met those apprentices. And most recently, I was out in Penrith and I met one. They'd just finished their 4-year apprenticeship. That would never have happened. Our $110 billion pipeline of infrastructure projects is supporting economic growth and resilience, especially in regional Australia. More than 11 million Australian taxpayers are benefiting from income tax relief, as we promised. And the latest ATO tax data shows that younger Australians have benefited more than most. Under 25s have benefited on average by more than $2,400 under our plan. That's a decline in their tax bill of some 20%. That's what keeping more of what you earn looks like. An average Australians are also now 47 months ahead on their mortgage repayments, compared to 30 months back in September of 2019. And there's an estimated $245 billion in additional savings on household balance sheets since the pandemic began. Australians have been very wise with their money, very wise over this pandemic. They've exercised good judgment, good discipline. Over 300,000 Australians now have been directly assisted into home ownership during the past 3 years, directly as a result of government programs like Home Builder and the Home Guarantee Scheme. It's what we promised to do at the last election. We said we were going to get people into homes, and we've directly assisted 300,000 of them into them. And at a time when North Atlantic economies are experiencing energy shortages and price spikes, the official ACCC data shows that electricity prices, the Minister for getting electricity prices down is over there, Angus Taylor, are now 8% lower than they were 2 years ago. The lowest in 8 years, saving households around $128 a year. So that's what economic resilience looks like. But you must project that into the future with a clear plan, and we have a clear national economic plan for jobs. In 2022, our focus is squarely on locking in our economic recovery to create jobs and more jobs. We are passionate about getting Australians into jobs, and we have the experience, we have the track record, and we have the economic plans that back this up. Jobs change lives, they change families, they change communities. They give Australians purpose and independence. They free them from the clutches of welfare and dependence. And they do the heavy lifting on transforming the budget also. I believe we can now achieve an unemployment rate with a 3 in front of it this year. Our goal is to achieve this in the second half of 2022. We have not seen this in Australia for almost half a century. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. What it means, unemployment with a 3 in front of it, is that as our economy changes, there are jobs to go to, enabling families and local communities to plan for their future with confidence. It means that when our kids leave school or finish their apprenticeship or university, they can focus on the job they aspire to rather than worrying about whether they can get a job. There is no more important vision than having a country where we enable our kids to realise their dreams about what they want for their life. And this fits with our broader vision as a government for Australia, the Liberals and the Nationals together, where Australians can live the life they choose for themselves and make their own way, to run their businesses, to get that job, to get the skills they need to achieve their goals, to own their own home, to raise and educate their kids the way they want to do it, to be able to save for their retirement and not get into too much debt, and take that occasional family holiday, to give back to their community wherever they can, as they want to, including taking care of that local environment that they prize, and to live in a country that is safe and secure. These are what I describe as the great Australian aspirations, and they depend on a strong economy. A strong economy means a stronger future, and this cannot be taken for granted. As we approach this year's election, this means strong economic management is more important than ever. Our National Economic Plan has enabled us to drive our economy, as I've demonstrated, through this pandemic. The plan seeks to create jobs by securing our economic recovery from COVID and setting Australia up for the future. The plan has 5 core elements. You've heard me talk about it before. Keeping taxes low and cutting red tape to drive investment and enables Australians to keep more of what they earn, as we promised. Secondly, investing in the infrastructure and skills development and growing our workforce to meet the demands of a growing economy. Thirdly, delivering the affordable, reliable energy that Australian businesses and especially regional economies need to power their futures ahead, while reducing our emissions to achieve net zero by 2050 and reducing household electricity bills. Fourthly, making Australia a top 10 data and digital economy by 2030. And fifthly, securing our sovereign manufacturing capability, unlocking a new generation of high-wage, high-skill, high-tech jobs. Now, this plan, I want to stress, has another important overarching objective, and that is to ensure that we grow our economy and we grow Australia in a way that we grow together and not apart. That means not just in our cities and our suburbs, but in our regions and our towns and our remote communities. We must grow together. And that's something I think the Liberals and Nationals bring together in what is quite a unique coalition for this country and is so important for Australia's future. I've spoken before about many elements of this plan, and I'll do so again, you can expect, in the months ahead. And there'll be further announcements to be made. Of course, there's a budget at the end of March. Today, I want to conclude, though, by announcing how we are going to take our modern manufacturing strategy to the next level. First, instigated by Karen Andrews, who's with us here today as Minister for Home Affairs. And we're doing that by fusing it with greater investment in our world-class university research capabilities. Our modern manufacturing strategy has set out clear principles to build new sources of growth and scale in 6 key areas where Australia has significant comparative advantage, strategic interests and the capacity to harness new opportunities. Medical products, food and beverage, recycling and clean energy, resources technology and critical minerals processing, defence industry and space. To date, we have committed over $312 million in funding to boost manufacturing capability and supply chain resilience, leveraging $677 million more in private sector investment. We now need to better link and leverage our world-class research sector to boost these efforts. 85% of Australian research is rated officially at or above world standard. Yet we continue to underperform frustratingly in achieving commercialisation outcomes. We need to shift the focus from citations to commercial success. We need to accelerate the forging of linkages between Australian industry and Australian university researchers. We need to develop a new breed of research entrepreneurs here in Australia so they can create the new products, the new companies, and most importantly, the new jobs. The government's University Research Commercialisation Plan will align these research priorities with our modern manufacturing strategy. We're going to fuse them together. It will focus research effort on the same 6 manufacturing priorities. In November, I announced the first element of this plan, one I'm particularly excited about, the Trailblazer Universities program. This will see eligible universities undertake reforms, including to intellectual property arrangements, and provide clear promotional pathways for academic researchers engaging in commercialisation activities. Now, the first step is underway. There are 8 university proposals shortlisted to share in $243 million of investment, working closely with industry partners. And regions, they're going to do great in this program. They really are. Funding of $30 million will see participating universities partnering with the CSIRO to access specialist equipment, enabling researchers to prototype and test technologies at scale. Today, I'm announcing the cornerstone of the government's new approach to turning great Australian ideas into commercial success. A $1.6 billion program called Australia's Economic Accelerator. In driving commercialisation, the key policy challenge surrounds the so-called valley of death, where early-stage research is frequently not progressed to later stages of development because of the risk and uncertainty about commercial returns. Now, some years ago, when I was Treasurer, we changed a lot of the tax rules to deal with that. We know it's not insurmountable. Other countries have been able to do this and made a better fist of this, solving this problem, particularly in the United States. And our own expert panel that we pulled together, and I thank for their great work and the input and their collaboration, made a point of this in looking at this evidence. Australia's Economic Accelerator will be a stage-gated competitive program designed to attract projects at proof of concept or proof of scale and their level of commercial readiness for both, but with high potential. It will allow Australian innovators to access funding opportunities for each stage of their project, provided they can continue to prove project viability and, importantly, commercial potential. Industry involvement and engagement is required. It's absolutely necessary at every stage, with the CSIRO's main sequence ventures engaged to catalyse venture capital investment in R&D in the final stage. And another key part of our plan goes directly to people and culture. Only 40% of Australia's researchers work in private industry, well below the OECD average. This, together with low mobility between industry and the university sectors, leads to culture and capability gaps that reduce the ability of Australian businesses to innovate. Now, to tackle this issue, the government will invest in a new suite of industry, PhD and research fellowship schemes to create Australia's new generation of research entrepreneurs. We'll invest in an additional 1,800 industry PhDs and more than 800 industry fellows over 10 years. The $296 million investment aims to fundamentally reshape the workforce of Australia's universities and career options, encouraging mobility and collaboration between the university, researchers and industry. It's time to get together. Our $2.2 billion university research commercialisation package will focus the considerable research power, our smartest minds of our universities, on Australia's national economic priorities. And as we drive down unemployment, we'll also be driving up the creation of new products and new companies here in Australia, backing our best researchers and their ideas to ensure Australia's economy roars back even stronger in the future, with leading-edge manufacturing at its core. We make stuff here, we make it really well, and we're going to keep making it under our government. Now, in conclusion, you'll be pleased to learn, there are times in all of our lives, and for nations, when things don't come easy, when we persevere and struggle to push our way through. We've known these days, I've known these days. And at those times you remember, you look back and you say that that's the time I became stronger. This is one of those times, and has been. Despite the challenges we have faced, Australia, I believe, is stronger and more resilient today than when I stood before you a year ago. Our COVID response has delivered one of the lowest death rates, highest vaccination rates and strongest economies in the world. And we remain well prepared for the future. Just like before, it won't be perfect, but the experience we have gained, the investments we have made, and above all, the resilience that Australians themselves have shown mean that we can see our way forward together. We cannot take this for granted. Now is not the time to turn back. This year, we must work to bring as much normality back to people's lives as possible. And at the same time, we must ensure, as we battle this constantly shape-shifting pandemic, that we continue to make those big calls necessary to keep our economy strong, keep Australians safe, and keep Australians growing together and not apart. It requires experience, it requires careful deliberation, it requires fiscal responsibility, well-developed plans, and above all, the courage to take decisions that stand up for Australia's interests and not be intimidated, as we have demonstrated, especially over these past 3 years. It's not a time to have an each-way bet on Australia's future. We must continue to build our strength and resilience and not put everything you have worked all so hard for and made great sacrifices for at risk. Because in times like these, that's what truly matters. Thank you for your very kind attention.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that very extensive address. It's a new year, so a good opportunity to clear the air. You've acknowledged today you didn't get everything right and that you understand the frustration people have felt over the summer. But do you want to take this opportunity to actually say sorry for the mistakes you've made as Prime Minister? Not just about COVID, everything from going to Hawaii during the bushfires through to not having enough rapid antigen tests in place, even as you foreshadowed the switch to a greater use of them, and for failing to live up to your pledge to hundreds of thousands of people on the NDIS that you would make sure the scheme was fully funded, uncapped and demand-driven. And will you apologise to people who've had, the hundreds of people who've had funding arbitrarily cut under the scheme?
Well, thanks for the question.
Always happy to ask you questions, Prime Minister.
Yep. We're all terribly sorry for what this pandemic has done to the world and to this country. These are the times in which we live, and I've set out today, I think, very clearly the challenges that we've faced. But I'm also very proud of Australians and what they've achieved in enabling us all to come through this despite the setbacks and the challenges that we have faced. In terms of the things, when I say we haven't got everything right, let me reflect on a couple of them for you. First of all, as we went into this summer, we were optimistic. I was optimistic. We're all desperately looking forward to a great summer. And one of the things we learn again is that the virus has a way of bringing you back to earth. And I don't think, as we went into the summer, I think we were too optimistic perhaps, and we could have communicated more clearly about the risks and challenges that we still faced. And I think in raising those expectations about the summer, that we heightened the great sense of disappointment that people felt. And as we had to make massive changes because of Omicron, as I said, the rapid antigen tests had only actually even been approved for use by the TGA earlier in November. We'd agreed at the meeting of National Cabinet about how they'd be funded and who had to go and get them. And so we moved quickly because we hadn't anticipated that we would have a variant that resulted in the vaccine not being able to stop the transmission. We had invested so much, and Australians had invested so much in getting those vaccinations. And over November and December, we were focused on the booster program, the children's program, and at the same time, Omicron came and completely turned things on its head. So we moved quickly, and I've set out the steps that we've taken to work that around. And in our communications, we have to be clear about that, because we can't lift people's hopes and then disappoint them. And I think that's what happened over the break. Secondly, on the vaccination program, if I had my time over, I would have put it under a military operation from the outset and not later in the year. We'd all worked up the plan together, been through Cabinet, our Cabinet, been through the National Cabinet. We'd set out the timetables. We'd had the goal of ensuring that everyone who wanted a vaccine could be offered one by October. For the record, that was achieved on the 25th of October. And as we went through those early months and we had the challenges that we have with the Health Department and us dealing with many, many issues, I took the decision to send in General Fruin and change the way we did it and set up a change in the command structure, how logistics were managed, how it was planned, and it worked. But I wish we'd done that earlier. And that's a lesson. In the aged care sector, we knew, well, I should say, we learned that the interface between the aged care sector and the public hospital system was blurred. And so when the storms of COVID hit, that created some real challenges. And in the aged care sector, and I remember it was one of the hardest days of the pandemic, with St Basil's. And we had a whole health workforce stood down because of COVID rules, so understand that, but left an aged care facility with no staff. And I had to send the military in that night. The interface and whether patients could be moved and how and when from aged care facilities into hospital cities, private and public, that emerged earlier in the pandemic. And so that could have been done better between both the states and ourselves. But as you can see, these are not simple issues with simple solutions. They're complex, and events can work against you. But what I say to Australians on every occasion where something hasn't been gone exactly as we'd hoped, or we've got it exactly right, or how way we would like it to have turned out, we've crushed together, worked the problem, solved it, and moved forward. And that's what Australians expect of us. I don't think they expect perfection, but they do expect you to keep working it every single day. And that's something I'm very proud my government has done. Now, on the NDIS, we are fully funding the NDIS. It's one of my great passions, as people know in this place. And I will never let people down if I can help it in the NDIS. It's a huge program. It's a program that is well expanded beyond what the Productivity Commission said it would, well beyond. The design of it and how it was set up has contributed massively to the costs, and those designs, we're not having much success in convincing those at state level, Commonwealth level, and then through the Parliament as to how that can be best managed. It's going to be a big challenge in the years ahead, the NDIS, but people know I'm totally committed to it.
So you don't have to say sorry about any of those things?
I think I've explained my answer fairly fully.
It's very full. Chris Ullman.
Prime Minister, Chris Ullman, 9 News. The cost of living is a daily concern for most Australians. You talked about the dream of home ownership. With the median house price hitting $1 million in 3 cities, that's become a nightmare for many young Australians. Is there anything you can conceivably do about that? The cost of petrol rose 30% last year. Now, that's set by international marketplaces, but you do control excise. Would you, like John Howard, consider pausing excise if it continues to rise? And what about the price of gas? You must have considered the possibility that Russia will invade Ukraine, cut Germany's gas supply, and the price will skyrocket. Can you conceive of making sure that Australian gas prices don't follow world prices by having some of the market kept here?
Well, you've rightly set out, Chris, the economic uncertainty that we're facing globally, and that's very true. The global economic situation is full of challenges and plenty of surprises and many threats to Australia. And that's why economic management, I think, is more important than ever. As I mentioned, the inflationary pressures on Australia are building, but they are not like we're seeing overseas. And how you manage inflation principally is particularly how you manage the national finances. They are things that we have control over. And the fact that in the course of this pandemic, we've been able to maintain our AAA credit rating, despite having to spend significant amounts. Those who have looked at our fiscal plans and made assessments about it could see what we were doing, how we're seeking to target it. It was time limited. Others wanted us to keep spending. They wanted us to extend JobKeeper. That was running at about $11 billion a month. They wanted us to pay for things that people are already doing on vaccines. They wanted us to spend money, some $13 to $18 billion on things that were better targeted to those who needed concessional access and needed on those tests. So how you manage your budget is very important about how you control inflation. And we have a good track record on that. On home ownership, it's always hard to buy your first home. It's terribly hard, and particularly in the city I'm from, in Sydney. I remember it, Jen and I remember it ourselves. It's hard. And it's still hard, and I'd argue even harder. And that's why at the last election we came up with, I think, some very effective programs that, we can't manage what happens to house prices, but we can help people get into homes. And our government has helped 300,000 Australians to get into homes. 300,000. And Australians have wisely, built up their own storehouses during this pandemic to deal with these shocks that are coming. They said 47 months on average ahead of their mortgage payments. That's discipline. That's wise. And so Australians, together with the government, are going to continue to, I think, to exercise responsible judgment about our finances. Invest in the things that help grow in our economy, because a strong economy then enables you to guarantee the essential services that Australians rely on, like the NDIS, like health, aged care. If you don't have a strong economy, you cannot pay for the NDIS. So that's why these things are important. So I acknowledge, Chris, that these are great pressures. An 8% fall in electricity prices. Now, who was predicting that 3 years ago? But we said we were going to get electricity prices down, and the measures we've put in place have helped that outcome. So we'll keep pursuing those policies, and there'll be more, to help people get that first start in their home, as we have seen, and to ensure that we keep downward pressure, whether it's on inflation or interest rates, to ensure that Australians can continue to get a go. But if you lose control of the financial and economic management levers, then Australia's worst fears on the economy would be realised. And in the issue of Ukraine, I should say, this is a very distressing and concerning situation. You've asked specifically about what it means for gas prices. Well, we have the security mechanism here in Australia, and we know how that can be used. Australian gas must be for Australians, but there are also opportunities for our gas producers who've invested billions. And so on both of those issues, I think we will manage them carefully and in Australia's national interests.
Claire Armstrong.
Thanks, Prime Minister. Claire Armstrong from the Daily Telegraph. Many Australians viewed the responses to the events in Parliament last year as representative of the experiences and the treatment of women everywhere. You've had multiple reviews. You've got the Jenkins report on your desk. There's been a staff training video and a hotline. But what actually makes Parliament and political offices more safe for women now than they were 12 months ago?
Well, I'd say the most important thing that has happened is we now have an independent complaints mechanism. This was one of the key recommendations and the one we have acted on. And we've done that together as a Parliament, together. And that, I think, assists everybody who works in that building, not just the politicians and their staff. That process that we examined closely, that let down so many a year ago and before, has been significantly changed, and for the better. And we have learned from those times, and I believe it's safer today than it was a year ago because of those changes and the brave stands that people have taken on these issues. And I've listened carefully to them and reflected on them. And we'll continue to work to ensure that those processes work for people, because if you find yourself in that situation, it's incredibly important that there are those there to help you and support you, to be able to make good decisions for you and to address the things that you need addressed to make the place safer. And so the independent complaints mechanism that we've put in place and the counselling support and the other things that sit around that, I think provides an environment, should God forbid that ever happen to anyone again, that they will find a situation very different to the one Ms Higgins found herself in.
Just before we go to the next question, Prime Minister, are you happy to keep taking questions?
Absolutely.
Yep, good, thanks. For our viewers at home, after 1:30, the ABC main channel will cut out, but you can be able to continue watching on the ABC 24.
About everybody's questions.
Be here for a long time. Mark Riley.
There might be a few. Prime Minister Mark Riley, the 7 Network. On your bonuses for aged care sector workers, which have been generally accepted as a good thing, although some suggest in the shadows of an election they sound like how to vote checks. The sector says, and the workers say, what they really need is an increase in their base rate of pay. These are appallingly low-paid workers doing extraordinary work, not just in the pandemic, obviously much more obvious during the pandemic, but every day for our older citizens. Labor says it will intervene in the Fair Work Commission case to argue for an increase in their base rate. Why won't your government do that?
Well, let me address your first question. The $400 payments, retention payments, that's what they effectively are. We've already done this once before, and we know it works. And with the workforce challenges we've had, particularly over Omicron, that's why this has come about, not for any other reason as suggested. What we're doing here is helping the aged care providers give that support to aged care workers during this pandemic to be able to keep them there working in those facilities, which is incredibly important. That's what it's designed to do. And we know it was effective last time, and we believe it will be effective again, and it needs to happen now. And it has been done in consultation with the industry as well, one of the things that they have been calling for, as we've responded to the Omicron variant. So that is why we're doing this. We've done it before, and we're going to do it again. And we believe that will help manage the significant demands on those workers themselves, as well as the aged care facilities. Now, the other matter, I've noticed the suggestion made by the Leader of the Opposition. I haven't heard how he proposes to fund that. I don't know what he estimates the cost of that will be, and how he would work that through. So that's for him to explain as to how he can pay for the things he tells Australians he thinks he can do. I've always been, I think, pretty upfront about that sort of thing. And there's a process underway, and we'll let that process follow its course. And we'll, of course, have to absorb any decision that is taken there. And that's the way I think these things should be dealt with. But, you know, we've all had experience with those who've worked in aged care, particularly if you've had a parent who's been in palliative care, end-of-life care, and we're incredibly grateful. And there are many things we want to do in this country, and we want to encourage them to do that. And the aged care workforce strategy, which has been worked together by the Minister for Health and Aged Care and the Minister for Workforce, Stuart Robert, will further address our plans to support the aged care workforce, and we'll have more to say about that.
Andrew,
I can assure you our plans will be costed, our plans will be funded, and we'll know how they work.
Andrew Clennell.
Andrew Clennell from Sky News, Prime Minister. We've got up to 100 Australians a day dying with COVID, a low booster rate, inflation, indoor businesses in Sydney and Melbourne on their knees without your support. What are you going to do about these problems? Have you lost touch with ordinary Australians? And on that theme, off the top of your head, can you tell me the price of a loaf of bread, a litre of petrol and a rapid antigen test?
Well, let me talk to you about a couple of things on that point. First of all, during the pandemic, you can't pay for everything because it all has to be paid for. Over the course of this pandemic, we have provided over $100 billion in economic support. JobKeeper being the most significant, and that has saved businesses across this country. And we're doing that at a time, and the COVID disaster payments as well, when we had shut businesses down. Not the virus, the government took decision to shut businesses down. And of course, in those circumstances. But one of the things we have to be very mindful of, Andrew, is that this thing isn't over yet. It's not over. The next variant could have any number of permutations to it. And so when we decided to do JobKeeper, we said it's going to start and it's going to finish. And people asked the Treasurer and I the same question that you're asking me now. Why are you pulling JobKeeper away? Because that's what you do when you're responsible and running a government. You can't say yes to everybody all the time. And you have to do things which ensure that you've got your government and your bank balance as a government able to deal with the next challenge. I mean, our opponents wanted to keep it going. They would have spent $11 billion a month. Keep going. They would have spent $6 billion paying people to have a vaccine they'd already had. And $13 to $18 billion on tests, when free tests were already available to those who needed them and those who are on concession cards who needed them and have equitable access to them. So these are hard choices, Andrew. They're very hard choices, and you make them every day in a pandemic. Now, I'm not going to pretend to you that I go out each day and I buy a loaf of bread and I buy a litre of milk. I'm not going to pretend to you that I do that. And I'll leave those sort of things to you, mate. And you can run it. But the point is, I do my job every day to ensure that those things are as affordable as they possibly can be for Australians every single day. As I said, our inflationary pressures in this country are lower than what we're seeing in other countries. And it's important that we ensure that people are able and have the resilience to deal with those economic pressures that are coming, just like my answer earlier. You know, it's going to be tough in the months, years ahead. There is going to be strong economic challenges. And you've got to make decisions in real time and ensure that you've got the capacity to deal with the challenges that are yet to come. And that's what people will get from me. That's what responsibility looks like. Not saying yes to everybody and telling them everything they want to hear, saying one thing to them in one part of the country and another thing to them in another part of the country. You don't get that from me. I've got it from both of my previous opponents politically. And I think Australians make a judgment about that, about whether they actually have the responsibility and the discipline to carry what is a very weighty office.
And I just remind my colleagues that we're asking one question each. Thank you, Andrew Clennell. And Andrew Probyn.
PM Andrew Probyn from the ABC. As you've indicated in your speech, you recognise that people are very disappointed, angry over summer. Your colleagues say that anger with you is very high on the ground too, and that your disapproval rating, recognised in the news poll, it's 58 disapproval, to remind you, negative 19% approval rating, that you are a drag on the coalition vote. Why are you the best person to lead the coalition to the next election?
I have a great trust in the Australian people. I think they're very wise and I think they're very discerning. I think they take elections very, very seriously because they know the consequences. And there's a difference between answering a phone and walking into a ballot box and making a decision that has consequences. And I know from my own experience that they will weigh these things up in the months ahead, and they will make careful judgments about what's important. And they know that the times we face are very challenging. They know that the security situation we face in the world today is very challenging. And they'll be saying, who has the economic plan and economic management experience to ensure that I can stay in my job and my business can succeed, that can get electricity prices under control and bring them down, that will best support me in saving for my retirement, that will ensure that my kids are getting those skills training, like those record apprentices and trade training that we've been able to put in place. And who has that experience and who has that understanding of the complexity of these challenges to make all that work? And they'll weigh that up. And they'll wonder, with what we're seeing in our region and the threats to our security, well, who's shown that they're able to stand up for Australia's interests? Whether it's standing up to other countries in our region, standing up to the big tech companies, standing up to the banks and the energy companies. That's my form.
Are you talking here of your colleagues or voters?
No, I understood the question. And so I'm talking about Australians because they're the ones who will be voting. And as they assess all of these things, they will make this choice, Andrew, at that time. And between now and then, they'll have the opportunity not to vote it at a referendum this year. There's not a referendum on the government. This is a choice about who's going to lead the government after the election. And there are two choices. And they'll be able to see the differences between those two choices and I think weigh up the consequences of those two choices. And they'll carefully consider it. Australians, you know, in between elections, they tend not to focus that much on politics because they're focused on what matters most to them, not the political goings-on of this place. They're focusing on getting their kids through school. They're focused on running their businesses and staying in their job and paying the bills and looking after and caring for family members, and that's what they're focused on. But the time for the election will come, and when it does, they'll weigh these things up and they'll quietly get about their business.
Peter Van Onselen.
Peter Van Onselen, Network 10. Prime Minister, at the start of your speech, you mentioned your close friendship with Maurice Payne. I wanted to ask you about another close friend, Gladys Berejiklian, and that's somebody that you wanted to run, actually, at the next election. I've been provided with a text message exchange between the former New South Wales Premier and a current Liberal Cabinet Minister. I've got them right here. In one, she describes you as, quote, a horrible, horrible person, going on to say she did not trust you and you're more concerned with politics than people. The minister is even more scathing, describing you as a fraud and, quote, a complete psycho. Does this exchange surprise you? And what do you think it tells us?
Well, I don't know who you're referring to or the basis of what you've put to me, but I obviously don't agree with it, and I don't think that's my record.
Catherine Murphy.
Apologies, that changeover was less than elegant. Prime Minister, I want to take you back to aged care, which you referenced a moment ago. Now, more than 400 aged care residents have died of COVID since the beginning of January. There are active outbreaks in about half of residential aged care facilities as we sit down to lunch today. And the booster program for aged care is running behind where it needs to be. Now, a second ago, you acknowledged the problems in aged care in the first wave. Obviously, there were hundreds of deaths then. And you presented aged care as a lesson learned. Doesn't this suggest that the lessons haven't been learned? And in terms of taking responsibility, that was an important theme in your speech. You've got to know what you're responsible for and what you're not. Aged care is absolutely the responsibility of the Commonwealth. You fund it and you regulate it. So why do these errors keep being repeated for a cohort of Australians who are frail, vulnerable and at risk during the pandemic?
Well, thanks, Catherine. As of now, let me say this first. Every single death, some 3,750 of Australians that we have lost, is a terrible loss. Every life saved is a great blessing, as I said also. In the course of this pandemic, many lives have been lost. In the course of this pandemic, many, many lives have been saved. That is the reality of a global pandemic, and I think Australians understand that. You made some points regarding the booster shots. 99% of aged care facilities, I'm advised, have been and will be around today, will have been visited to offer those booster shots. We have not mandated the taking of boosters by aged care residents. We have for aged care workers, but not for aged care residents. Some 61%, as you know, and every death is tragic, in aged care have been with those residents who are in end-of-life care. And the balance also have other serious underlying health conditions. And so that creates a further challenge. We've had, from memory, around 566 deaths in aged care since our first Omicron case. In the first terrible wave we had back in 2020, there were more. But I suspect there'll be more now, and that is terrible. And so the booster shot, we encourage people to take. But where families have decided and where individuals have decided not to take it, then it's not for me or the government to tell them about the decisions they're making in that very sensitive time of their life. I've been in that situation, you may have too. They're sensitive situations where families make decisions. So I'm going to honour and respect their decisions. With aged care, with the boosters, as I said, 99% out there and visiting, and they'll be going back again and encouraging them to get those booster shots. And in the outbreaks themselves, the provision of the testing kits that have been an important part, the acquiring of the additional PPE to support the aged care facilities, I think has been incredibly important, and what we've been able to do. There's some 12.8 million masks, 5 million gowns, 14.7 million gloves, 3.6 million goggles and face shields, and 7.7 million rapid antigen tests have been sent out there over the course of 2021 to aged care facilities. So they're the tools you have to try and ensure that these outcomes don't occur. And that's what we're doing each and every day. People going into these facilities, where it's the aged care workers, those running the centres or others, making sure we get the workforce. But it's very difficult and it's very challenging. And so we're going to keep fighting away on this and trying to save every life that we can.
Phil Curry.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, Prime Minister. Just a quick question. You've talked today about lessons learned, things you may have done better, and had your time again, and so forth. Would you be open to the prospect, should you prevail at the federal election, to some sort of national assessment of how the way the nation has handled COVID, like a Royal Commission or some other inquiry, as Anthony Albanese flagged in this venue a week ago?
Well, right now we're fighting the pandemic. And that's where I'm very focused. And there'll be a time for that. One of the first things we did in the start of the pandemic, and I offered it to the Leader of the Opposition, is we set up the Senate inquiry. So we've actually had a Senate inquiry effectively following and inquiring into our handling of the pandemic right from the start, concurrently. So not something after. We actually set up a parliamentary inquiry with those who are not our political opponents, who've had the opportunity. There have been some 56 hearings of that committee, some 211 hours of cross-examination of health officials and others who've been involved in our response. So I would say that is set up, I think, a very transparent process. And everything from vaccinations to aged care to the important challenges of addressing the needs in our Indigenous communities. So we have shown right from the outset a preparedness for that to be available. So we're already doing that and have been. What will be required into the future? Well, I think we can deal with that at a later time, because right now I think those two things in place are doing that job. Accountability through the Parliament, through the Senate committee, and us getting on with the job each and every day of fighting this pandemic.
Sam Maiden.
But, you know, we haven't ruled that out, Phil, as to the point. It's just not a decision for now.
Samantha Maiden from news.com.au. You made the point that it's pretty tough purchasing property in Australia right now, but it's a lot easier if taxpayers are paying you $291 a night to sleep in your own home, which is how the current system works for MPs. So most of the MPs and ministers in this room, if they stay tonight, they'll be paid $291 a night to stay not necessarily in a hotel, but in their own home. Now, if you work for the Defence Force, you're not allowed to do that. It's described as suitable accommodation. You can't claim that money. So how is it fair that you're prepared to pay up to $800 bonus in 2 tranches to aged care workers who have been literally working among the dying and the dead during the pandemic, but you're going to pay all of these politicians $873 to sleep in their own beds for 3 nights when they come to Canberra?
Well, for the record, I only own one home, the one that Jenny and I own back in the Shire. I don't own 3 homes, I don't own 5. I don't have a problem with owning homes, people investing, trying to do things for their future. But that hasn't been my experience. We've rented all the time I've been here in the Parliament, so this is not something that I've had any direct involvement with. Others may have, and I make no judgment about that.
Why not?
Well, because what I would expect to happen is that the independent processes that are set up to look at members' entitlements, and that's the wrong way to talk about them, that the support that is given to members and senators to come and do their job and be here in Canberra and so on, that is done independently of government. And it should be done independently of government. It shouldn't be a matter of political football. It should be one where those who can look at the circumstances fairly and make judgments about it. And then this is not something that just I have done as a Prime Minister. I think every Prime Minister has done that, and certainly has moved towards that to make these decisions, you know, one step removed from politicians.
So you won't ask your MPs not to claim the money if they own their own home?
I expect all of my members and senators to comply with all the rules that are in place. I do. I expect them to do that.
Thank you.
David Crowe.
And if those rules need to change, then I'm sure those who are responsible for ensuring those rules are fair and reasonable would bring forward recommendations to that end. That's what I would expect them to do, as that's their job.
David Crowe.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Prime Minister, for your speech. David Crowe from the Age of Melbourne and the Sydney Morning Herald. One of the symbolic issues around the summer outbreak for many Australians, a practical and symbolic issue around preparation, was the shortage of rapid antigen tests. What went wrong at the federal level last year? Because you've always said that future waves would arrive, future variants would arrive, there would be new challenges with this pandemic, and yet there were not enough rapid antigen tests in stock in Australia when that threat arrived over summer. And related to that, do you have any intention, willingness, plan to invest in local manufacturing of rapid antigen tests? And if so, would that actually be able to help ease the shortage before the federal election?
Let me start with the last one. Already happening. It's already happening. I mentioned one of them in my speech today where that's already occurring. There are a couple of companies up in Queensland that as yet haven't received TGA approval for that. And they were the subject of some issues over in the United States, but the TGA have been working through that, so people can't manufacture something that isn't approved by our regulators. In fact, as I said before, the TGA only first approved home self-testing of rapid antigen tests on the 1st of November last year. So prior to that, and in many states, they were actually outlawed. They were outlawed.
Were the TGA too slow?
The TGA have been doing their job. And they have approved more rapid antigen tests for home testing than they have in the United States. I think it's some 47 or so tests off the top of my head. And that is a large amount to get through. They've also been approving vaccines. They've been approving oral treatments. They have had a workload like none other, and they're still doing all the other things that aren't related to the pandemic. So no, I wouldn't make that criticism. I think Professor Skerritt and his team have been working under enormous pressure, but they're not rapid antigen tests. The medical advice going back to October of 2020, both the CDNA and the AHPPC, the medical expert panel, recommended against the use of rapid antigen tests. That happened again in February of 2021. The medical advice to the government was not to use rapid antigen tests. And then we, in August, commenced a trial and purchased rapid antigen tests for aged care. So we began that in August of last year. As the cases, and then in November, as I said, the approval came through. On the 5th of November, National Cabinet met soon after that, a few days after that, to consider what should then happen. Now, remember at that time, there was no Omicron. The medical advice was that the right testing process was PCR tests, not rapid antigen tests. No medical body, no state government, no one anywhere came forward and said these tests should now be used for this purpose, who were responsible providing that advice to government, okay? And the reason for that was we were in Delta and we were focused on getting the vaccinations in place because that is what would prevent the transmission, because it was effective against transmission. What happened with Omicron is that flipped it completely, and it did it within a matter of weeks. And so there had been no suggestion that rapid antigen tests from any official health advisors to the government was something as a priority over children's vaccinations, over the booster shots, which was our primary tool to stop the spread and enable us to go into that summer. Now, Omicron changed all that, and it changed it almost in an instant. And there were many other complications, particularly for workforce. And those early weeks in December were very difficult because we were trying to get from the medical advice, and there wasn't a lot of data around at that point, is this virus actually less virulent? Is it less impacting, severe than the Delta strain? And until we could know that, we kept the rules in place around 7-day close contact and all of these things, and that then impacted the workforce. But we hadn't yet got the health advice definitively, and we were asking at every meeting, because we were meeting weekly, and we're saying, is it less severe? Is it less severe? And when we learned that it was, then we could start to address those changes in 7-day arrangements, close contacts, essential workforces. Had we not done that, then, and it had proved to be more severe, or as severe, you'd be asking me different questions today. So the rapid antigen test challenge was one that was brought on by the Omicron variant because the PCR tests couldn't keep up with the rapidly increasing cases. There had not been, leading up to that time at the end of November, an expectation that cases would soar to those levels under the Delta strain. And under the Delta strain, that wouldn't have occurred.
But should anybody have seen that coming? Isn't that the point of government at a state level, at a federal level, to plan for that, to plan for another outbreak?
Well, no country did pick that. Which country did?
The UK had plenty of rapid antigen tests, had big supply.
This is the difference. The UK had already been dealing with very high case numbers, very, very high case numbers, through the Delta strain and the earlier strains. And in the UK, the volume of that challenge had already moved them to rapid antigen tests. PCR tests were still the right standard. They had to, during the earlier phases, which Australia did not have to do, because we didn't experience the waves that the previous countries had done previously. That was a a step they took in the earlier strains because the virus had spread far more widely. That didn't happen in Australia. So we could keep using the right tests, the PCR tests. The reliability of rapid antigen tests is not the same as PCR. The South Australian government has been able to keep their focus on PCR tests, and I commend Stephen Marshall for that. They've been able to keep that gold standard. Rapid antigen tests are things that you only go to when you have a volume challenge that we had not had and we would not have had under Delta because of our high rates of vaccination. That's why that wasn't anticipated, but became the issue when Omicron struck. As I said, Omicron was like dealing with a completely different virus. It changed so many of the rules and it had its impact. And that's what we experienced over summer. And over the summer, we've been all working to turn that around. There are more rapid antigen tests available now. There are more treatments available. And the case numbers have been peaking in many of our states and territories. And our supply chains are being restored.
The final question is from Greg Brown.
Prime Minister, Greg Brown from The Australian. Ahead of the 2019 election, the coalition, like now, was in real political trouble. And you successfully exploited two advantages. You were a more popular leader than Bill Shorten, and Labor had a lot of big, scary policies that you tore apart. 3 years later, you're an unpopular leader, and Labor has got a small target strategy. So where does the political winner come from? Can voters expect tax cuts over and above what's already been announced? Or will there be a big spending commitment?
Well, it's a similar answer, Greg, to what I gave before. As to our policies and commitments going forward, people know we're a low-taxing government. People know we want people to keep more of what they earn. They know that because they're experiencing it. We said we'd do that, and we're doing it. And they are receiving that now, and they're keeping more of what they earn. And so if you want taxes to remain low, then vote Liberal and National, don't vote Labor, because their form on taxes is the opposite. They've already opened the batting on their higher taxes and they've already started that. And once they get started, you know they can't stop when it comes to taxing you. But this election, again, is a choice, and every election is. And this choice isn't about a referendum-style choice, a yes and no on the government. It's about, do you want the Liberals and Nationals, with myself as Prime Minister, with our record on economic management and national security that keeps Australians safe, keeps our economy strong, that pays for the NDIS, that pays for aged care, that enables us to battle this pandemic, that shows responsibility, even when responding to those challenges with the nation's finances, which means your job, your business, and all of these things are more secure? Or do you want Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister and the Labor Party and their policies and their record on having an each-way bet on the budget and an each-way bet on national security? So that is the choice of an election, and Australians will have the time to weigh these things up, and they'll make that decision very carefully. They'll be very aware, I think, by the time we get to the election, about the world we will face and the country circumstances that we'll face in the years ahead. They've been quietly getting about their lives these last 3 years. The things that we said we'd do, we've done. We have.
But the economic...
And we'll get on with that job, and they'll make their judgments about who they think is best able to deliver them a strong economy and a stronger future. And our government's record, and my record as Prime Minister and as Treasurer, I think speaks to both of those things. And when you talk about experience, well, I've delivered 3 budgets as Treasurer. I've delivered 3 budgets as a Prime Minister with the Treasurer. I've sat around the national security table dealing with some of the biggest challenges this country has faced over the last 8 years. I've sat around the Expenditure Review Committee of Budget for the last 7 budgets. That experience counts when it comes to dealing with the challenges that Australia is going to face. And it's not just me. I look around this room at Maurice and Peter, Karen, Angus, Barnaby. I look around the room of people who have been in the trenches battling this pandemic and the hard circumstances we're facing regionally over these last particularly 3 years, standing up for Australia, standing up to those who would seek to injure our interests. That requires strength. It requires a calm experience. And Australians will make that choice, and I'm looking forward to it.
Prime Minister, thanks for your time today. As is often the case, we will be giving you this very nice card as a guest speaker to be a member of the club.
Thank you.
And we're just wondering whether you would take up the opportunity of debating Anthony Albanese here or in any other place during the campaign.
Well, it's interesting you ask, because I remember standing right here with Bill Shorten, and Sabra was the what's over here, was it? And Sabra asked me, would you agree to have a debates commission? And I said yes, and Bill said yes. Now, Special Minister of State is sitting at the back there, Ben Morton, and he has developed such a proposal and has been working, as I'm sure you probably know, with the media and with others, the political parties, to seek to establish such a commission. I support it. Anthony Albanese doesn't. So I'm sure there will be debates, and we'll have to go through the usual process that happens. I think it's better to have an independent process like the one that we were recommending, to avoid all those shenanigans and games that opposition leaders like. I don't know why he doesn't support an independent debates commission. I think it's a good idea. I said I'd do it. Bill said he'd do it. Anthony says he won't.
Will you do a debate, though?
Of course I will. Of course I will. We'll be debating lots.
Please thank the Prime Minister.
Thank you.
That's where we leave the Prime Minister at the National Press Club.